All right. So, where we're at. So, last time we went over some aspects of physical development in early childhood, in our early childhood years, and we talked about physical growth, but then we also talked about physical risks to children, and we ended with a discussion on potential causes of harm and early risk factors that children can experience that can influence them throughout their life. And we had an assignment associated with that, and I hope that you took a look at it and went through it, and I look forward to seeing what you came up on that conversation. And um, yeah. But now where we're at, I can't think, is on cognitive development. And again, cognitive development is the uh, the how we think. It's our thought processes, our memory system, our ability to, this example is, solve problems and put a triangle in a triangle hole and a circle in a circle hole and coordinate ourselves and understand and symbolize and language, all of those things that require thought process. Okay. And if you remember from the beginning of the class, we introduced Piaget's theory of development, of cognitive development, where he suggested that when we're talking about early childhood years, we're going through what he called the pre-operational stage, which is largely a period of time where children are starting to symbolize and represent their world. And so this is where we're developing language, where we're putting labels to things. This is where we're starting to learn the semantics and providing meaning to something. So we start to start to develop simple sentences like with nouns and verbs, and then explicitives. Okay, and I have mentioned several times in this course that the probably the most important thing we can do during early childhood is play and exploration. Okay. The research on this is really clear. Just by measuring the amount of play a child has is directly associated with educational outcomes, social outcomes, and a whole host of different positive outcomes for children, because what they're doing is they're engaging and discovering their world. Okay. And so uh, to expand on the symbolization, and I know I've mentioned this a lot of times about the symbolization of the pre-operational phase, is it's during this time period we'll learn somewhere between 30 to 60,000 words. But the reason Piaget thought that this was a pre-operational phase is that thought lacks what he saw operations, meaning mental actions that follow a systematic rule of understanding. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean that in the early childhood years, children don't create meaning out of stuff and try to solve problems. It's that they don't use some type of formal systematic rules, such as the ones that you see, for example, in mathematics, and solving algebra problems and equation problems, okay, where there's a certain steps that you have to take in order to get to the right conclusion, okay? Instead, what we see in children in the early childhood phases is the use of symbols to express themselves, more in what we call intuitive thought, okay? And intuitive thought is making decisions based upon how it makes you feel internally, what feels right and what feels wrong. Okay. Often this is mistaken in early childhood for children being sensation seekers or attention seekers or gratification. And that's really where a lot of kind of mix-ups between intuitive versus logical thought is mistaken in early childhood, because adults interpret a child's behavior based on operation about the child is systematically cognitively developing their actions and their behaviors, and they're intentionally then making a decision to get to behave in a certain way. And that's not really a appropriate description. What they're using is their intuition to determine whether a behavior is right or whether it's wrong. It's more of how it makes them feel in that moment rather than some logical adult based, this is the result I want. These are the steps I need to do to get there. And therefore, the child is acting behaviorally because they're choosing to behave that way. So that's kind of again, misinterpretation of really the child. Okay. The other type of reasoning that we find in this period of development is something called transductive reasoning. Okay. And this is, again, a Piagetian term. It refers to a type of thinking where a child links two unrelated events because they occurred close in time without using logic and cause and effect reasoning to make some inclusion. Okay. In a simple terms, it's when something happens because that happened. Okay. And so it kind of an example of transductive reasoning is when a child says, I didn't take a nap today and now it's raining. So it's raining because I didn't take a nap. Okay. It's that kind of in statistical terms, it's what we call an illusory correlation, where two things happen together, but they are completely unrelated, but we make this correlation between them and associate them together. Okay, and that's transductive reasoning. Egocentrism is, again, when we went through Piaget's theory, I mentioned that there's two times when we're most egocentric. Um, the first time is in early childhood, and then the second time um, is in adolescence. And when we've measured egocentrism, that tends to be um, when we are the most egocentric. So so an example of egocentrism in early childhood is, for example, a 4-year-old covers their eyes during hide and seek and believes no one else can see them because they can't see anyone, meaning that because they're kind of the central figure, that if I can't see them, they can't see me. Okay. And this shows egocentrism because a child has difficulty understanding another person's perspective and assume others experience the world the same way they do. Okay. And so it's the inability to see other people's perspectives because the world is supposed to be centered around me and my experiences. And so those that happen to others is not possible. Okay. Now the fight through centrism and the kind of the conflicting part of early childhood is their development of theory of mind and this egocentric perspective. Okay, to kind of rehearse some of the things that we've talked about theory of mind. Theory of mind happens between about 24 to 36 weeks of development. It's where we develop the sense of self, that I am an individual separate from everyone else with my own thoughts and feelings. And others, therefore, have their own agency, their own self with their own thoughts and feelings. Okay. And we find that children with a stronger theory of mind tend to be less egocentric, whereas children who have what we call a weaker theory of mind tend to be higher in egocentrism. Okay. And we find this true in both early childhood and adolescence. Now, I want to make this clear though. We are all different on theory of mind, based upon a host of factors, the biological, psychological, social. And so saying that a child who is more egocentric is less sensitive to the feelings and emotions of others and something is somewhat of a stretch, but it's a mindset. Okay. And it's something that then is developed in middle childhood, where we actually see children being more sociocentric than egocentric. And then when we go through adolescence, we convert back to more of an egocentric view. Okay. The other thing that we often see in early childhood is the idea of animism. Okay. Animism is, it kind of goes two directions. It's giving nonsense objects life. And we'll go through an example here in a few minutes where we have like a circle following a triangle, which is following a square. And what do children do with that? They make up a story. They make up and they might say, well, the square is a bunny and it's being chased by the triangle, which is a fox, which is being chased by a turtle, which is the circle. And they'll animate it in some physical way. They'll give it some type of life and story instead of saying, well, there's a triangle and a circle and a square, and they're all going in a circle. But we'll get to that example here in just a minute. The other version of animism is giving animals human-like characteristics. So giving the stuffed bear a human personality, giving the pet, the dog, a human essence, that it can talk and speak and it has its own personality and all of those kinds of things. So it's giving um, animal objects and whatnot human qualities, and non-human, non-animal objects life, as you would say. And then, as we saw in the previous lecture on Piaget, one of the things that we find in the pre-operational phase is a lack of conservation, that mass will stay constant even if it changes shape. And again, this goes back to the idea of mental manipulation, as we showed um, in the three mountain task and in the beaker task and the clay task at the beginning of class. Okay. And indeed, we find that children tend to have this idea of reversibility. Okay. Um, and so kind of continue this. We've mentioned use of symbols representing things that are not immediately in front of them. Symbolic drawing. This is a lot of the basis for working with children who are nonverbal or non-expressive in art therapy is that we often find that children can express themselves through drawing and art. Sometimes if they're unable to express themselves in words and emotions, mainly because they can retreat into their fantasy world where they've built explanations for what's going on in their world. And this is through fantasy play, right? And we've talked about the importance of things like fantasy play, especially when children use role playing. And this is where they're really trying to take on the traits that work for them versus the traits that don't, and really explore different aspects of what they feel is good for them and what's not. Okay. Part of that intuitive thought um, is is this is the Y stage of development. Now, I mentioned intuitive thought. Some because emotions and emotional responses can be ambiguous. This is why children go into the why stage during this developmental period, and they constantly ask why? Because what they're actually trying to do is they're not looking for this logical step-by-step process. What they're really looking for is connecting with what they're experiencing with the emotions that they're feeling. Why they want to know why when teacher says you need to color in the lines and they have an emotion that no, I don't. Look, I can color outside the line and it makes me feel good because it's my art. And so they have a conflict between their emotion. Yes, it feels okay to color outside the line, but teacher is telling me I can't. And so they have a conflict between their emotional state and what's being directed towards them. And so they'll sit there and ask why? Us as adults think they're looking for reasoning. They're looking for the reason why they should color in the lines, not about the emotional conflict the child is having. And so if you want to reduce the why questions, focus on the emotion the child is having and the conflict they're having between what you're asking them to do and their emotional state of it, and you'll reduce the whys. Um, in transductive thinking, this is where, again, it kind of goes off the intuitive um, end, but it's where children are more influenced by what they perceive in their world and creating their own explanations. And that's really transductive reasoning. Okay. And let me explain this a little bit more clearly. So an example of a transductive example is, let's say a child states, I wore my superhero shirt today and we had pizza at school. So wearing my shirt makes pizza happen. Okay. The child links these two events simply because they occurred around the same time, not because the actual caused the other. This type of reasoning is common in this developmental phase. So that's kind of transductive reasoning. It goes back to this concept that we talked about with, well, we talked about the transductive reasoning in the other slide, but it's a kind of, I think, a more clearer example. Okay. And again, this is just an example of the egocentrism, and this is one of the things that the three mountain task kind of shows, is that egocentrism really is the component that prevents a child to not be able to mentally take something and manipulate it because they feel that their experience is what they're supposed to experience. And the three mountain task kind of expresses this ability because a child feels that what, in this example, the teddy bear should be experiencing exactly what the child is experiencing. So they're unable to, one, recognize the little bear has its own experience. So in order to understand the little bear's experience, I need to put in their shoes and see what they see because they should be seeing what I see. Okay. And this is why, again, in a lot of early childhood settings, perspective taking is part of the kind of what you would call the curriculum, and helping children understand their actions may have a total opposite reaction in another child. And so a lot of times you'll see in an early childhood setting, um, um, the teacher, they get in conflict with another child, and one child calls the other child a name. And the teacher will often ask, how do you think that made that child feel? Okay. And what the teacher is trying to promote is this idea of perspective taking, that the way you think you are trying to make them feel isn't always what that other person is going to experience. And so it's a way to kind of help them develop in their development to go from an egocentric view to a perspective taking view, and really increase those things like emotional intelligence and theory of mind kind of activities. Okay. And again, this is an example of the conservation task. Because this looks different, it must be different. So there must be more or less, because it's my perspective of its change, not its actual change. Okay. And again, that goes back to that perspective taking and the child's experience. Okay. All right, this is the example that I told about animism, about meaning making. So in this, if I wish I had a smart student who could put this in a PowerPoint slide to where these things were rotating for me. Hint, hint. Anyone out there that can develop that slide for me, I'd appreciate it. But let's use our imagination. So imagine that these three objects are rotating in a circle. So it could look like the triangle is following the circle, and this circle is following the triangle, and they're going in a circle. Okay. Children in early childhood will not make the logical analysis of this. They won't say that there's two circles and one triangle that are rotating in a circle. Let's use this direction, counterclockwise. Um, and there's one triangle and two circles. That's the kind of logical kind of explanation of this. But what you'll often find in early childhood is that children will animate these things. So the example I used before, that maybe the triangle becomes a fox and the two circles are bunnies that the fox is chasing, or the circles are mom and dad following the triangle, which is the child or me, and mom and dad are trying to catch up with me. And they'll create and what they'll do after they name the objects is they'll create a story that provides it with some type of meaning. Okay. Um, one thing that has been noted, though, is the majority of children, when given this task, who have moderate to severe autism, they won't animate. For about 70% of children who have moderate to severe autism, they will give the correct logical thing that is going on. They will say there's three objects rotating in a counterclockwise motion. One is a triangle and two are circles. And that is something that we found with autism, with not all, but a good percentage of children with autism, they will lack the storytelling of an animation of objects. They will give the literal perception of what they're seeing instead of giving it some storyline. Okay. Now, we don't find this so much with children who have mild to mild moderate autism. And we don't find it all with all children who have moderate to severe autism. So, which suggests that this isn't a causal link, the inability to not animate objects or give objects human or creature-like qualities isn't necessarily a feature or a causal reason for autism, but it's something that many will miss in their developmental their development, that tends to be something that a good portion won't pick up as part of their developmental experience. Okay. And so this is something that we do note in differences among children. And again, autism is an example where there is a percentage that will not experience the animation. And I will say not 100% of children who don't have autism will animate either, but it's a greater than chance that children will. So that's another thing that needs to be stated as well. And I will say the inability to not animate has nothing to do with intelligence, cognition, ability to do that. We do find being able to story tell, to create meaning out of things tends to be more difficult. But as far as intelligence and ability to navigate the world, they do it differently, but they're capable of doing it. So, but this is mainly an example of animism. Okay. I mentioned earlier in the course that there's development in the beginning of the course. There's developmental theories that we really didn't really focus on in our introductory period. One that has had an influence on American human growth and development over about the last 30 years is one by Vygotsky. Okay. And he came up with what's known as a socioculture theory of cognitive development, where he emphasized the role of culture and social situation in the child's development. Okay. The reason why I say that it's only been introduced here in the United States in about the last 30 or 40 years is Vygotsky developed his theory in Russia, previously known as the Soviet Union, when the Cold War was going on, and he wasn't permitted, and American psychologists weren't permitted to communicate with other psychologists in the Soviet Union about their theories and whatnot. And so it wasn't until the end of the Cold War where this kind of was um, developed here in the United States. I want to give that historical kind of precedence because I'm going to bring this up. Our federal government, for example, has prohibited me as a psychologist with sharing education outcomes, research outcomes with certain nations. I'm not prohibited to talk to other psychologists in China, Russia, Taiwan, Vietnam. If I do, the institution I work with can be fined and I can be prisoned for up to 10 years. I bring this up because this isn't an uncommon thing not to be able to share knowledge between nations because one nation doesn't like another nation. So, just a kind of a historical note if you are going into education and hoping to get global knowledge. Okay, off my soapbox on that topic. But Vygotsky, what he really emphasized is the interaction between the child and those around the child and those who are important during different developmental periods. Okay. And he emphasized what's known as a zone of proximity. And I think I might have a slide, but basically, the zone of proximity is a distance between a child's independence and ability and what they can do with help. So, for example, in infancy, the zone of proximity is very, very close, right? Because the child is completely dependent upon the caregiver. Okay. And then in early childhood, we tend to then expand to our siblings and our other relatives that are not primary caregivers. And then as we build more independence, we'll expand into child cares or preschool settings, kindergarten, and the amount of attention that we need in order to support our developments gets wider and wider and wider. Okay. To where, again, as an adult, we are self-sufficient. We can feed ourselves. We can clothe ourselves. We can warm ourselves. Okay. And this is what's known as doing, also called scaffolding, where, again, this is more of an education theory where it kind of presents, for example, in the education series, how much support does the teacher need to provide in the beginning development of, for example, reading? And then as a child becomes more and more competent in reading, the teacher is less and less involved so that the child learns to be more independent as they develop the ability to read on their own and those kinds of things. And that's known as scaffolding. Okay. And so I just wanted to introduce this because, again, it brings up the importance of culture and community in a child's development. And at certain developmental points, we need to be closer to the child and build independence, and then work with where the child is developmentally. Okay. Let's We've also mentioned in this class time and time again the idea of play. And I want to bring up the importance of the role of caregiver. In this example, it's the teacher and the child. Okay. And we have two types of play for the teacher. In one role, the teacher is passive, meaning they just let the child play in some kind of way. And then there's active type of play. This is where the teacher is involved and is part of the play. And then, of course, the child is passive. This is where the child freely chooses, is kind of, they can play or they can't play, they can rest, they can be active, versus active play where they're encouraged to go and explore. Okay. So let's start these different levels of different types of play. So when the teacher is passive and the child is active, this is what's known as discovery-free play. Again, in the early childhood setting, this is where the classroom is set up with different stations. So one might be a Lego station, one may be a book station, one may be a uh, doll station, and the child is said, okay, you choose where you want to play, and they'll go and free play and do free discovery in the station that they choose. Okay. When the teacher is passive and the child is passive, this is what we call maturation rest. This is where the child has the ability just to relax and chill, or they can actively involve themselves in play. What this, so in discovery play, this is where the child is learning that it's okay to explore their world, to be engaged in the world. In what's called maturation rest, this is where the child learns that they don't always have to be actively engaged, that it's healthy to take breaks. It's healthy to disengage once in a while. Okay. When we're doing teacher active play and child active play, this is what's called scaffolding guided play. So this is where the teacher may kind of role play something. So maybe like for examples with Legos, the teacher creates a little house out of Legos, and then the child does the same thing. So it's kind of this teacher does something active, and then the child does the same thing until the child, and it's called scaffolding because the goal is that the teacher become less and less active in the engagement, and the child gains independence through that guided play. Okay. When the child is passive, though, and the teacher is active, this is where we get rule-based games. This is where children are given a set of rules and are expected to follow those rules. The best example of this that I can come up with is, for example, a board game um, where there's a set of rules. The child doesn't set up the rules. They don't set up how the game board is established, and everything is set. And then the teacher guides them through the rules, and then the child then, in a very passive way, plays the game based upon the rules of the game. Okay. And why is this an important type of play to also engage in? Well, there's a lot of things in life that we have to passively accept, such as it's not okay to go murder your neighbor. I know this is a far stretch from a board game to murdering your neighbor, but there's certain rules that we have to follow because we have to follow them, and that we don't get to actively construct those rules of life. Okay. So it's not okay to go steal. I may want to, but I can't. Okay. And so that's the idea between teacher active play or instruction and child passive play, because it kind of sets up those things that even if you want to do that, you can't. And keeps life civil and all of those things. And we all have to kind of abide by those things. Okay. So this is kind of the four different types, and each of them have a place. And that's the important thing to state, is that if you're setting up activities for your children on a weekly basis, or if you work in an early childhood setting, you want to set up your curriculum or your activities for children that just don't focus on one of these domains. It needs to be a mixture of all four. Okay. Because they all have a different instructive experience for the child to experience. Okay. I do want to talk about language and language ability. And the point of this lecture is not about really economic status. It's not about, even though they are the measures of it, they're about the engagement we have with children and our ability to engage with children. Okay. We find that in higher social economic status homes, such as professional homes, parents have the financial freedom, the educational freedom to be much more engaged with their children's language than what we find in middle, low income or with children who receive federal assistance, where parents are constantly under the stress to make sure that there's housing, there's food, there's the child has schooling, all of those things. And so the investment ability of these parents to engage in their children's language is lower. It's not because of the parent. I want to make this clear. It's because of the situation that puts demands on on parents. Okay. And so what we find is that when parents have the ability to be more fully engaged with their children, these children tend to have a higher vocabulary than um, in situations where parents don't necessarily have the ability to fully engage with their children, okay, such as children receiving types of federal assistance programs, welfare programs, those kinds of things, okay. Now, the part of the good news is, and this is kind of the proof behind this, is that um, and this is another example. So the one thing that I do want to focus on is while this is vocabulary, when it comes to communication in the development of things like simple sentences, being able to put not nouns and verbs together, um, we find that children tend to be able to develop these in congruency with each other, regardless of economic status. So while there's vocabulary differences, the ability to communicate on the most basic human levels, economic status seems not to matter. Okay. Now, when it does come to more complex sentences, which combines the higher vocabulary with the communication, we do see some slight differences. So we see that parents who are high school graduates, their children tend to develop complex sentences at a slower rate, whereas parents who have a professional degree or a college degree, children tend to develop more complex sentences at an earlier stage. Okay. Again, this one is a combination of the vocabulary advantage and sentence combination. But again, the ability to communicate and get ideas across does not seem to be influenced by the difference in a parent's ability to engage with their children. So some things to kind of think about when it comes to these different vocabulary and communication differences. Okay. All right. So that kind of ends our conversation. And again, I want to just kind of emphasize on the last part of cognitive development, the reasons I brought up the interaction between the teacher, caregiver, and the child, and the language is that the interaction between the child and the caregivers, the parents, the early childhood education teachers, make a difference in a child's vocabulary, the ability to develop complex sentences, the ability to understand the world through play and understand themselves through play and exploration. All of those are important. And so emphasizing that a child will develop cognitively on their own is not the best approach with a child. They need that social world, which brings us to our next topic, which we will talk about this coming Tuesday, which is socio-emotional development. And I will end with this point because I just want to make the connection between our class on physical development and our class on development on emotional and social emotional development. Is if you remember, a child becomes aware of their body in space and time. They become aware of how their body compares to other children. And so they start to develop body image. And so probably the most important topic while the topic we should pick up first when we talk about socio-emotional development is self-conscious emotions and the development of things like pride, shame, and guilt in the early childhood period, where these types of emotions tend to be developed and can be ingrained in the child's psychological interpretation of their world. I'm going to stop my sharing here.